Do you know what it feels like to listen to your own funeral while you're still breathing? My son just leaned over the kitchen island, checked to see if my vacant eyes were staring at the wall, and whispered to my daughter that in that state-run facility in Ohio, I wouldn't last a year. He said it with the same casual tone a man uses to discuss trade-in value for a used car. They think I'm gone. They think the man who raised them, the man who built this house and the small fortune inside it, has dissolved into a puddle of forgotten memories and neurological static. They believe my Alzheimer's is so advanced that I can't process the English language anymore. But there's one problem. I am perfectly healthy. My mind is as sharp as a razor, and they just signed their own death warrants. The fog started about 6 months ago. At least, that's when they told me the fog started. It began with small things. I'd find my car keys in the freezer.
I'd wake up and find the front door wide open in the middle of a winter night. My wife, Martha, would look at me with these big, performative tears welling up in her eyes and tell me that I'd forgotten our 42nd anniversary dinner. I felt a hole opening up in my chest, a terrifying void where my identity used to be. I started to believe I was becoming a ghost in my own home. Before we go further into how I discovered the terrifying truth, if you enjoy these stories of justice and resilience, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring more of these incredible journeys to light, and you won't miss the moment the tables finally turn. Every morning, Martha would bring me a quote 1 to help with my quote 2. Within 30 minutes of drinking it, the world would go soft at the edges. My limbs felt like lead, and my thoughts would drift like smoke. That was when the gaslighting really intensified. They brought in Karen, a quote 3 with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. She treated me like a toddler, talking to me in a high-pitched voice while she moved my furniture around or hid my phone right in front of me. They were systematic. They were professional. They were making me doubt the very ground I stood on, all while Karen whispered to my wife about quote 4 and quote 5. I spent months in a state of suicidal depression, truly believing my brain was rotting from the inside out. I felt like a prisoner in a body that was failing me, watching my family mourn me while they were actually just waiting for my pulse to stop so they could cash the check. But the universe has a funny way of revealing the truth when people get too comfortable with their lies. It all changed because of a child's toy. Karen was the angel my family brought in to manage my descent into darkness. She was a middle-aged woman with a clinical, scrub-wearing professionalism that hid a soul made of ice. Martha introduced her as a godsend, a specialist who knew exactly how to handle patients like me. To the neighbors, we were the picture of a devoted family. To me, Karen was my jailer. She had a habit of stroking my hair while whispering things like, "Don't fight it, Harry. Just let go. It's easier if you don't try to remember." Her primary job was the medication. Every afternoon, she'd stand over me, making sure I swallowed those little white pills that left a metallic taste in my mouth and a heavy curtain over my mind. If I resisted, she'd call my son David, who would come over and look at me with such rehearsed disappointment that it broke my heart. "Dad, don't be difficult," he'd say. "We're just trying to keep you safe." They had me trapped in a loop of artificial confusion and emotional blackmail. The cruelty was in the details. Karen would purposefully misplace my glasses and then act concerned when I couldn't find them, suggesting I had hidden them myself in a fit of paranoia. She'd play recordings of static in the hallway at night to keep me from sleeping, then tell me the next morning that I had been, quote, 11 again. I was living in a psychological horror movie where everyone I loved was a supporting actor in my destruction. I felt myself slipping. I started to accept that maybe I was truly broken. I would sit by the window for hours, watching the birds and wondering how much longer I had until I didn't recognize my own face in the mirror. They were so confident in their victory that they stopped being careful. They started leaving papers out on the kitchen counter, brochures for Sunset Acres, a facility that looked more like a warehouse for the forgotten than a home. They were already picking out which of my antiques would go to auction and which would end up in my daughter's living room. They were grave robbers, and I was the grave. But their arrogance was about to become their downfall, and it all started with a forgotten plastic monitor in the shape of a bear. The turning point happened on a Tuesday. My grandson, little Leo, had been over the day before and left one of his toys in my study, a plastic baby monitor shaped like a teddy bear. He must have tucked it behind the heavy drapes while playing hide and seek. I found it while I was leaning against the wall, trying to steady myself from the morning tea Martha had served me. As I reached for the toy, I heard a crackle of static.
The other half of the monitor must have been left on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, voices filled the room. It was Martha and Karen. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Is he down yet?" Martha's voice sounded different, sharper, colder, devoid of the fake honey she used when speaking to me. "He's drifting," Karen replied with a dismissive laugh. "The double dose in his breakfast should keep him compliant for the lawyer's visit later. He didn't even notice the bitter taste this time. He's becoming such a docile little pet." My blood turned to ice. Martha sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of grief. Karen said, and I could practically hear the smirk in her voice. I stood there in the shadows, clutching that plastic bear so hard my knuckles turned white. The fog in my head didn't vanish, but it was pierced by a bolt of pure, crystalline rage. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being murdered in slow motion by the woman I had slept beside for 40 years and the children I had sacrificed everything for. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were killing the man I was to steal the man I used to be. The depression that had weighed me down for months evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. They wanted a ghost? Fine. I would give them exactly what they wanted, right up until the moment I pulled the floor out from under them. The realization was a physical blow, worse than any punch to the gut. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, realizing that every memory lapse and every clumsy mistake had been a choreographed move in their sick game. My own wife had been poisoning my morning tea. My own son was shopping for sports cars with my life's work while I was still sitting in the room. The sheer cruelty of it made me want to scream, to run into the kitchen and flip the table, to demand they leave my house. But I knew that wouldn't work. If I confronted them now, they'd just call the paramedics, claim I was having a violent episode, and have me committed even faster. They had spent months building a paper trail of my, quote, 22. I was one man against a family of liars and a professional manipulator. I had to be smarter. I had to be the man who built a business from nothing, the man who knew how to spot a hostile takeover before it happened. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. I heard Martha laughing in the living room, a sound that used to bring me peace, but now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I thought about the thousands of small moments we shared, the vacations, the birthdays, the way I held David when he was a baby. How does love turn into this? How does greed eat a person's soul until there's nothing left but a predator? The pain was overwhelming, but I forced it down into a small, dark box in my mind. I couldn't afford to be a father or a husband anymore. I had to be a survivor. I realized that my only weapon was the very thing they were using against me, my supposed, quote, 23. They thought I was a hollow shell. They thought I was a, quote, 24, as Karen put it. I made a vow right then. I would not drink another drop of that tea. I would not swallow another pill. I would watch them. I would record them. I would let them think they were winning, right up until the moment their world collapsed.
They wanted to turn me into a ghost. Well, a ghost sees everything, and a ghost has nothing left to lose. The hunt was on, and they didn't even know they were the prey. The next morning, the game truly began. When Martha brought me my special tea, I didn't look her in the eye. I kept my gaze unfocused, letting my lower lip tremble just a fraction. I took the cup with shaky hands and waited for her to turn her back to adjust the curtains. In that split second, I leaned over and poured the liquid into the large potted fern beside my chair. I made a loud slurping sound with an empty mouth, then wiped my sleeve across my chin like a confused child. 26, she whispered, patting my hand. Her touch felt like a snake crawling over my skin. For the first time in months, my head stayed clear. That didn't roll in. I had to work hard to keep my eyes glazed over while Karen arrived for her shift. She was even more brazen now that she thought I was completely gone. She walked right past me and grabbed a silver frame from the mantel, a photo of my late mother, and tossed it into a cardboard box labeled "Yard Sale." "He won't miss this, will he?" Karen asked, looking at Martha. "He won't even know it's gone by lunch," Martha replied, sipping her own coffee. I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, playing the role of the perfect patient. Inside, my mind was racing. I needed a way out, but more importantly, I needed evidence. I waited until Karen took her afternoon break to smoke in the garden. I moved with a speed I hadn't used in years, slipping into my study and locking the door. I grabbed my old burner phone from the hidden compartment in my desk, a relic from my business days they had forgotten to confiscate. I called Frank. Frank was a retired private investigator and one of the few men I still trusted with my life. When he picked up, I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Frank, it's Harry. They're drugging me. They're trying to take everything. I need eyes in this house, and I need them yesterday." Frank didn't ask questions. He just asked for the time. We coordinated a plan for the next day, when Martha would be at her, quote, 33, which I now realized was probably a meeting with a realtor. I was going to turn my home into a digital trap. I spent the rest of the day drooling slightly and, quote 34, how to use a fork during dinner. I watched my son David smirk at his sister across the table, a look that said, "It's almost over." They were celebrating my demise while I sat 3 feet away. They had no idea that the quote 35 was sharpening his teeth. The next day, the house was finally empty for 2 hours. Martha was out meeting a quote 36, and Karen had been given a long lunch break as a reward for her quote 37. Frank arrived at the back door disguised as a pest control worker, carrying a heavy toolbox. He didn't say much, but the look of fury in his eyes when he saw how thin I'd gotten told me everything I needed to know. "We don't have much time, Harry," he whispered. Within 40 minutes, he had installed high-definition pinhole cameras in the smoke detectors, the kitchen clock, and a decorative vase in my study. These weren't just cameras. They were linked to a secure cloud server that only Frank and I could access. He also handed me a small device, a digital recorder disguised as a button on my cardigan. Frank said, gripping my shoulder. After he left, I went back to my chair and waited. An hour later, Karen returned. She was in a foul mood. She walked into the kitchen, and I heard her talking on the phone. I sat in the living room, staring at a wall, but my heart was racing with triumph. I had her. I had her admitting to the drugging on a recorded line. That evening, my daughter Sarah came over. She was always the, quote, 42 one, the one I thought actually loved me. She sat beside me and took my hand. For a second, I thought she might confess, might apologize. Instead, she leaned in and whispered, quote, 43, quote. She was talking to me as if I were already a corpse. She was justifying her theft as an act of mercy. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, not because I was sad about my, quote, 44, but because I realized my daughter's soul was as hollow as a drum. I squeezed her hand back, mimicking a confused, desperate grasp, while thinking, "Enjoy the cruise in your dreams, Sarah. The only trip you're taking is to a courtroom." By Thursday, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from fake concern to a sickening sense of celebration. They thought they were in the home stretch. I sat at the dining table, picking at a bowl of pudding that I knew was laced with enough sedatives to knock out a horse. I had become an expert at the, quote, 45, pretending to eat, while actually depositing the spoonfuls into a napkin hidden in my lap. David and Sarah were both there, sitting across from me. They weren't even whispering anymore.
They were passing around a tablet, looking at luxury vacation rentals in Aspen. "We should go for the one with the heated pool," David said, pointing at the screen. "With the commission from the house sale and the liquid assets from Dad's offshore account, we can stay for a month. We deserve it after this hellish year." Sarah laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "I'm definitely getting that new SUV. I'm tired of driving that old sedan. And Mom, you should finally get that jewelry set from the estate auction next week. You've earned it for putting up with his episodes every night." Martha smiled, looking at me with a gaze that was utterly predatory. "It's what your father would have wanted," she said smoothly. "He always said family comes first. He just didn't realize that sometimes family needs to move on before the body does." They started discussing the new house for me, the state facility in Ohio. "It's a bit grim," Sarah admitted, checking her nails. "But it's cheap, and the paperwork is easy. Once he's there, we just need to make sure the staff knows he's highly combative, so they limit visitors. We don't want any old friends poking around and asking questions about his finances." I sat there, frozen in my Alzheimer's mask, feeling a level of disgust that made me want to physically retch. They weren't just thieves, they were ghouls. They were planning to throw me into a hole and bury me alive, while they spent my sweat and blood on heated pools and jewelry. My son, my daughter, my wife. They were looking right at me, and all they saw was a mountain of cash they hadn't yet climbed. Little did they know, the cameras were capturing every word, every greedy smile, and every heartless plan. The trap was set. Tomorrow was signing day, and I was going to give them a performance they would never forget. The morning of the big deal arrived with a deceptive silence. The house smelled like fresh coffee and expensive perfume. Martha was dressed in her finest navy blue suit, looking every bit the grieving but dignified wife. David and Sarah arrived early, wearing smiles that were far too bright for a family about to commit their father to a facility. They looked like they were waiting for a lottery drawing rather than a medical necessity. "Today is a big day, Harry," Martha said, kneeling by my chair and smoothing my hair. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. "We're going to fix everything. You won't have to worry about the bills or the house anymore. David will take care of it all for you. Doesn't that sound peaceful?" I gave her a slow, vacant nod, letting a bit of droil escape the corner of my mouth. I saw David's eyes flash with a mix of disgust and excitement. He checked his watch. Karen stepped forward, holding a small cup of water and 2 white pills. She said with a cold wink. I took the pills, tucked them under my tongue with practiced ease, and took a sip of water. As soon as she turned away to grab my cardigan, I spat the tablets into the pocket of my chair. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, a sharp contrast to the slow, heavy movements I was forcing my body to make. The doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. This was it.
I heard the muffled voices in the foyer, David welcoming the quote. They thought they had hired a man who would just look the other way, a man they had paid to witness a confused old man sign away his life. What they didn't know was that Frank had spent the last 48 hours working his magic. The man walking through that door wasn't their accomplice. They led me into the dining room, where the mahogany table was covered in stacks of legal documents. The quote 63 sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of professional indifference. My family gathered around me like vultures circling a dying animal. They placed a gold pen in my shaking hand and pointed to the line that would end my life as a free man. I looked at the paper, then at Martha, who was nodding encouragingly with tears in her eyes. The air in the room was thick with their greed. They were leaning in, their breath held, waiting for the ink to hit the page. They thought they were seconds away from victory. They had no idea they were seconds away from a nightmare. The room was deathly quiet as I hovered the pen over the signature line. David nudged my shoulder. Quote 64. I looked up at him, and for the first time in 6 months, I let the quote 65 vanish from my eyes. I dropped the pen. It clattered across the mahogany table like a gunshot. Quote 66, I said. My voice was loud, clear, and steady. The blood drained from Martha's face so fast I thought she might faint. Karen took a step back, her mouth hanging open. David tried to recover, reaching for the pen. I interrupted, standing up straight. I felt 20 years younger. I picked up the remote on the sideboard and pressed the button. The 65-inch television in the dining room flickered to life. Instead of the news, it showed a split-screen view of the kitchen and my study from 3 nights ago. The audio was crystal clear. The room echoed with Martha's voice saying, "I'm tired of playing the grieving wife," and David's cold laugh about the state facility in Ohio. Martha shrieked, her voice hitting a glass-shattering pitch. I pointed at the screen as it showed Karen crushing pills into my pudding while mocking my stupidity. Sarah started to sob, but it wasn't out of guilt. It was the sound of a cornered animal. The lawyer stood up and pulled a badge from his pocket. He wasn't their guy. He was an officer working with Frank's evidence. At that same moment, the front door burst open. 3 more officers and Frank stepped into the foyer. The officer said, his voice booming over their panicked shouting. I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut on my son's wrists. I watched as Karen tried to bolt for the kitchen, only to be tackled by a deputy. Martha was white as a sheet, staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I walked up to her, inches from her face, and whispered. As they were led out in a procession of shame, the house finally felt quiet. The trap had snapped shut, and for the first time in half a year, the air in my home was clean. They wanted me to be a ghost, but it was their futures that had just vanished into thin air. The silence that followed their departure was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. For months, this house had been a cage of whispers and lies, but now it was finally mine again. The legal battle that followed was grueling, but the evidence was undeniable. The video recordings and the toxicology reports from the quote 78 quote were the final nails in their coffins. Martha, David, and Karen are all serving significant prison time for their roles in the conspiracy. Sarah received a lighter sentence and probation, but she is legally barred from ever contacting me again. I didn't keep the money for myself. After selling the house that held so many poisoned memories, I moved to a small, sunny cottage near the coast. I donated a massive portion of my savings to a foundation dedicated to fighting actual Alzheimer's and supporting victims of elder abuse. I wanted my wealth to build something good, something that would cancel out the darkness my family tried to create. Now, at 64,
I'm living a life I never thought possible. I wake up every morning without a fog in my head.
I travel, I've taken up woodworking, and I've made friends who value me for who I am, not what's in my bank account. I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm a man who stood at the edge of the abyss and had the strength to step back. I'm healthy, I'm free, and for the first time in a long time, I am truly happy. Looking back, I wonder about the choices I made. Some people tell me I was too cold, that I should have just called the police immediately instead of playing a game with them. But I needed them to show their true colors. I needed to see exactly how far they would go, so I could cut them out of my heart without a single shred of regret. Do you think I did the right thing by letting the game play out to catch them in the act? Or was I too cruel in my revenge? What would you have done if you found out your entire family was plotting your disappearance? If you found this story powerful, please hit the like button and leave a comment with your thoughts below. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of justice and survival. Your support means everything. The end. Thank you for listening.